All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Welcome to another edition of Occult Mondays here on BBOR, and today we're doing something a little bit different. In the past, we're really just sort of talking about the nature of evil. We mentioned Dr. Michael Shermer in The Science of Good and Evil, also talked about the evil signs of cult leaders. But now let's just go back to sort of the mystic traditions of ancient Egypt. And, there are quite a few things here. First, I'd like to read something from The Culture of Ancient Egypt. This book is by John A. Wilson. So let's just listen in for a second. The Book of the Dead added a gloss explaining that this meant the cutting of a baby's navel cord. The coffin texts, the deceit which was in with me is driven away, and this was explained as referring to the washing of a newborn baby, not to an afterworld judgment and vindication. And the coffin text continue, I go on the way which I have learned upon the island of righteous, and was made to refer to a pilgrimage to Abydos, the city of the god of the dead. What I can really say, though, is the ancient Egyptians seem, very, very big on not only rituals, but also mysticism. And I really find that the word mystic is something that we use in kind of a variety of ways, because it's people would refer to a lot of things from ancient Egypt as mystical, mysticism, but we also talk about people like Plato and refer to him as a mystic, and you might be able to say that sort of, some of the cosmic statements about Albert Einstein would be also mysticism, and even Ludwig von Mises is also referred to as a mystic. But the ancient Egyptians really seem to have, a sort of fascination with body parts. Doing something to a particular body part would, produce some sort of kind of metaphysical reaction. And in this case, the cutting of the baby's navel cord, and this is a way to drive away deceit. Also, one of the absolute first rituals that I heard about from ancient Egypt was one involving the god Horus, and it's actually relating to Egyptian medicine. If you have a burn on your skin, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to pray to Horus and say, Thy son of Horus is burnt in the desert. Have you any water? I have water in my mouth and a Nile between my thighs. And that was sort of you could call it a prayer that's, you're asking for sort of medical attention, but that's supposed to help the healing process. Now let's also discuss something else, because they have quite a lot here written in this book by Wilson about the concept of Maat, M-A-A-T, and there's really actually an apostrophe between the two A's, but yes, Maat. And this is meaning truth, justice, righteousness, right dealing, or order. And this had thus become critically important for the supreme prize of eternal happiness. Mary Carre was advised by his father, Do Maat, whilst thou endurest upon earth. Why, he asked? The text goes on to relate royal justice upon the earth to the judgment at death. And this also relates to sort of, a very, very familiar concept of the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians really seem to be all about judgment after death, and it's stuff that you find in the Abrahamic religions. I'm not sure how much is, connected or influenced, but you do find this very similar concept, that after you die, you would be heading toward the, kind of like a judge almost, and you're going to see, were the good things that you did greater than the bad things that you did? Things like Maat. If you did lots of Maat, was that more than the bad things you did? And if you did more good things than bad things, okay, you're allowed to come into the heavenly realm, and all the bad things you've done will be absolved and abolished and, forgiven. So yes, this definitely seems somewhat Abrahamic, but Egyptian mysticism seems to go quite larger than that, because, there are also things like what we were sort of talking about with rituals, like the cutting of a baby's navel cord. As I understand about that, that is something that has to be done in a temple, and I'm always open to correction, just reading some things out. But what about some of the things that, could be done outside of a temple or outside of a palace? Well, some other similarities that I noticed between the ancient Egyptians and our current day Western world in the 21st century is that they also talk about, lots of things like superstition, good luck charms, which they would have referred to as magical amulets. And I just pulled up, something here about Heka, H-E-K-A, Heka. And, it's talking all about, sort of the magical practices associated with ancient Egypt. And yes, they were definitely using, they would sort of have a belief that, wearing a particular amulet or the possession of a particular amulet can ward off evil and bring good luck. And they're finding, this in so many tombs around, like the Egyptian burial sites. So it's really fascinating to hear that we don't really sound too different, and I don't really think that humanity has come that much, that much further than the ways of ancient Egypt. They're definitely into a lot of the same things that we would be about, some superstitious things, but also just sort of the belief system and this entire notion of mysticism. I mean, my sort of exception with mysticism is, the word mysticism really gives the kind of connotation that it's immediately equated with magic. But, we mentioned people like Einstein and Ludwig von Mises, maybe Gottfried Leibniz, we can put him in there with that group. Well, that's not anything magical at all. It's just sort of recognizing a larger place in the universe, which is, as I understand, that's what Plato intended with all this stuff. And, it's like, I think that, mystic is almost sort of a denigrating quality to somebody like Plato. It's almost a sort of a put down. It's like you're trying to equate him with something like magic. And it's like, you could say that for Leibniz and Mises and Einstein, you could call them mystics, but that's, not exactly magical. No, it's just sort of about recognizing the human place in the universe, that, you're sort of, some sort of interconnection, sure, but also just recognizing that there is something larger than yourself, and you have a connection to the earth and a connection to the cosmos. And I don't think that there's anything magical at all about this. It's just sort of like, I think that these ideas are in ancient Egypt, the sort of connection to the universe and connection to larger ideas. But they've definitely crossed over and incorporated a lot of this into things that are all about actual magic. Because, you can obviously make some differentiations between these sort of thinking of ancient Egyptian mysticism versus someone like Albert Einstein, who talked about the awe and wonder of the cosmos. I think that's very, very quite different, because the ancient Egyptians here are all about, something else that we can talk about called Akhu, A-K-H-U. And Akhu is all about, spells and sorcery. I think that comes out as the most the most simple translation that we can get. And, it's also not only performed by the gods, not only performed by the deities, but they believe that even the stars had, the ability to perform the Akhu, the spells and sorcery. And that is one thing that I just think sounds absolutely amazing. But, one of the things, though, about this here, that I'm just looking at this text, they also mentioned that the ancient Egyptians believed in magical dwarves. They believed that there were, dwarves that could have their own magical power, and they also had their own Heka. Fascinating stuff. But, one of the other things about Egypt is that we talked about, how darkness and light are sort of kind of metaphors for good and evil in the Western world, and whereas, in maybe something like the Far East in Asia, we have, yin and yang, which are more about, it's not good and evil, it's just light and dark, hot and cold, masculine and feminine, and I don't really know why they just sort of lump in all of those sort of very, very kind of downtrodden adjectives with feminine, but they did all the same. But, when it comes to ancient Egypt, it's not like that at all. Like the last upload I did for the occult segment was talking about why people perceive the light as something good and why people perceive the dark as something bad. But that's not the case at all when it comes to ancient Egypt, because as far as I know, the civilization was referred to as Kemet, K-E-M-E-T, Kemet, which literally means black. And they viewed like darkness as something that was good. They viewed it, as a good thing because of the black soil that was around the Nile. It was all about fertility. And there's also, this is also used in, statues and like iconography for ancient Egypt. Like if there is a person that is depicted as black, it means that, black represented life. So that means that that statue was painted when the person was still alive, as opposed to, they would not be painted black if they were dead. So that just stands out to me as just absolutely amazing, because it's like, I even thought about doing a continuation today on just, how did we get to this sort of association with darkness being things that are bad and evil, and the light being things that are, good and welcoming, and all of those, whatever sort of positive adjective you would like to attribute to that. But ancient Egypt isn't like that, and I just think that that is absolutely, it's just remarkable. And it's also good to know that, we really should just accept things like darkness and light as sort of metaphors, whether you're looking at it from the Western perspective or the Far Eastern perspective. And we also have to recognize that they aren't sort of universally accepted concepts. But another thing that they're noting here is the greatest magicians of ancient Egypt were the priests, because once again, many things like Heka are performed only in the temple. And when they're performing these rituals, you need the priest. And, I think that this is something that is somewhat of a parallel with a lot of other civilizations, because they have the shamans in many parts of the world, though I guess shamans are more associated with tribal things. But, Korea was also very big on shamanism, and I believe even to this day they still have, people who practice the indigenous Korean shamanism, and at the very least it's been combined into other things like that have evolved into their own spirituality. But if we're going to focus on Egypt, the sort of whole notion that, the priest is the person who is the one who can perform the spells, the magic, the sorcery, that is a very, very similar parallel, I think, to a lot of shamanism. And there might be some things that are different around the world, like we talk about darkness and light. The ancient Egyptians would view the dark things as something good, whereas the, things in the Western world view darkness and light as almost metaphors for good and evil. So there's some things that are kind of, very widely spread around the world, but other things are almost culturally relative, you could say. And, this text here is also kind of making some statements comparing things like, the ancient Egyptian mysticism and magical practice. Once again, I'm stating those as two separate things, mysticism and magical practice. So it's like they're comparing that to just sort of, paganism in Eastern Europe, and even what we can call Wicca, that has now grown to something much larger. I think, some people I've met personally that identify with Wicca would not really want to be called pagan. But, can I really ask you guys, just ask anyone who's actually listening in this far into the segment, what do you think? Do you think that Western civilization evolved out of Egypt? Do you think that, the sort of Martin Bernal theories that, the Greeks were influenced by the ancient Egyptians, and they sort of, not exactly copied the ancient Egyptian, the ancient Egyptian divinity? Or do you think that this is just something that is completely different, and this is, maybe there were contacts between Egypt and Greece, but that these are just, they evolve in completely different ways, and it's just, part of human evolution to develop these types of, mindsets. The same way, we have, shamans in North America from, the indigenous native populations that, as far as we know, did not have contact with the ancient Egyptians, but they're still developing somewhat of a similar spiritual belief system. And it's also about, the characteristics of the belief system. So, what do you think about that? Do you think that other things like, the Greeks, or maybe even the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Zoroastrianism, were inspired, influenced, had any sort of impact at all from the ancient Egyptians? What do you think about that? I just think, we really do have a lot of these very similar things, the concept of just using, what they call magical amulets, we call good luck charms, and I think those were much more popular when I was younger. I don't really hear too many people talking about, using good luck charms when, and actually have sort of a genuine belief in that. I grew up in the 1990s, and those things were everywhere, like the lucky rabbit's foot, or someone has a lucky coin. Those things were everywhere, and people really seem to hold on to them, but you never really know how much people in the Western world are genuine believers in superstition, or they're just sort of having fun. And Carl Jung talked about that when he's just like, yeah, people have fun with it for a while, and then they sort of recognize that, there isn't actually some sort of spiritual connection. And on that note, I'll ask the last question. What do you think about mysticism? Like anything I said about that, do you think that mysticism should be completely separate, from anything associated with magic? I almost think we need a different word for it. Just because I feel as soon as you say the word mystic, it sounds like almost like you're equating it with something magical. I think we just sort of need a different word for it, but I don't know what that would be. Well, this actually turned out to be a much longer segment than I thought about. I thought I would be only doing this whole thing in like 5 or 6 minutes, but it turned out 3 times longer and then some. Anyway, thank you so much if you've made it to the end of this segment, and if you have anything to say at all, please drop a comment below and keep in touch.